So our first talk this morning is by Sam Jones with Gert Westermann from Lancaster University and Bangor University, and it's entitled Under-Resourced or Overloaded, Rethinking Working Memory Deficits in Developmental Language Disorder.
Okay, so am I audible-ish at the back? I think I am. Okay, so it's very common for developmental psychologists to note the speed and ease with which young children acquire language. So this is a sentiment famously expressed, for example, by Steven Pinker in 1984, who wrote, "In general, language acquisition is a stubbornly robust process. From what we can tell, there's virtually no way to prevent it from happening, short of raising a child in a barrel." But for about 1.4 million children in the UK, language constitutes a significant challenge. These children might have what's called speech, language, and communication needs. And the population I work most closely with are children with developmental language disorder. A developmental language disorder affects around 7.5% of English-speaking children, and it's diagnosed when a child has severe language deficits which interfere with their day-to-day well-being in the absence of any clear biomedical cause, by which I mean things like the chromosome abnormalities that we see in Down syndrome. Now, if you work on neurodevelopmental disorders, diagnostic categories such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and so on and so forth, you quickly realize that these are really ill-fitting, that we see pockets of deficits in certain skills that transfer across these, and it gets very, very, very complex. And this is motivated increasingly what's been called a transdiagnostic approach to the study of neurodevelopmental disorder, or a skill-driven approach. Now, one skill that appears problematic for children with language disorder and comes up again and again and again is in auditory processing. The auditory processing deficits are widespread, though not universal in developmental language disorder. And some of our best evidence from this comes from pure tone studies. So a pure tone study works like this. Essentially, you expose a participant to a series of pure tones, and you monitor their response, for example, using EEG or some behavioral method. And it might look something like this. So you might have 3 tones of the form dum, 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 like that. And the goal is to differentiate the blue tones and the green tone, to notice that they are different. And what we find among a lot of children with DLD is that when you reduce the window between these tones, the frequency window, to around 75 hertz, 100 hertz in some cases, performance rapidly drops off among these children. Okay, and this is motivated what's known as the frequency discrimination deficit of hypothesis of DLD. So a frequency discrimination deficit hypothesis of DLD does fit within a maturational framework. So what do I mean by that? Well, the neural basis of frequency discrimination skills mature from the prenatal period through childhood, and it's possible that this process is derailed in children with DLD, but we're not quite sure what this looks like. So this is a picture of the auditory cortex, and you can see frequency sensitivity up here in this region where you have clusters of neurons that are sensitive to, for example, frequencies in the range of 300, 900, 1,800, and 3,000 hertz. It's what we call tonotopic mapping. And frequency sensitivity of this sort is a defining feature of the auditory pathway, and it's essential to the decomposition of natural speech. And we can trace this back, going back through the brain, through the auditory cortex, through the collicular nucleus, and so on and so forth, following out on the auditory nerve to the bottom left there. And we end up following the auditory nerve at this spiral structure known as the cochlea. Now, here's the cochlea in close-up on the left-hand side panel. And what you can see is the cochlea encases a membrane, which is essentially a ribbon of collagen, which at its base is firm and narrow, and that makes the fibers in that section of the basilar membrane vibrate maximally to high frequencies. At the other end of the basilar membrane, at the apex, the membrane is sparsely structured, the fibers within it, and it's wider, and that makes it vibrate maximally to low frequencies. So it has what we call a mechanical gradient based on the fiber structure within the basilar membrane. And this is called the mechanical gradient. And this, of course, is the basis of tonotopic mapping throughout the whole pathway, because upon the basilar membrane sit inner hair cells, which innervate the auditory nerve, and this all becomes tuned throughout the system, and this is vital to the decomposition of natural speech. It all becomes tuned as a property of this mechanical gradient of the fiber structure across the basilar membrane. This fiber structure develops In the prenatal period, what we see is fibers that are initially tangled, they are low in diameter, and they are sparsely organized, and these become increasingly dense and well organized. So the mechanical gradient of the basilar membrane is, it matures, and it's at the center of this tonotopic mapping that's essential to speech processing across the auditory and linguistic pathways. And that's more of what I've just said, okay? So what's really interesting is in some animal studies, you can disrupt this process of maturation in the basilar membrane. This has been shown in mouse studies where you manipulate the MLin2 gene, and what MLin2 codes for tissue elasticity. And what you see is you don't get this nice transition from sparsely organized, tangled, and low diameter fibers into something more regular and robust. You disrupt that process, and that, of course, disrupts the whole gradient of the basilar membrane, and then tonotopic mapping across the whole system. So my idea was that could this be at the heart of what we're seeing in DLD, some children with DLD, that you have this low-level deficit in the mechanical gradient emergence in the basilar membrane, and that compromises auditory frequency sensitivity across the whole system. Seen as the problem seems to be with spectral processing and frequency, it's probably a good candidate, I think, as the starting point, and it's a testable hypothesis. So the aims in this first step of developing this account were to develop a computational model of the maturation of the basilar membrane and its impact on speech encoding, recognition, and retrieval, and to determine whether a computational model with a deficit in basilar membrane maturation qualitatively captures data from children with language difficulties. I feel like I should rub the batteries on this. Okay, so what we did is we used a cochlear model, which is a model of the inner ear, plus the deep convolutional neural network. And I'm going to go a bit quicker, haven't I? So it works like this. It's trained on random samples of spoken words, authentic spoken words, which are then passed into this inner ear model developed by neurophysiologists who developed this inner ear system, which outputs this cochleogram, which roughly corresponds to auditory nerve response patterns. This is then passed through a deep convolutional neural network where it's classified at the end of a probability distribution over 35 possible words. So far, this setup's well established. It's been used in a ton of studies, and it captures, of course, the important differences that we all know about between the biological and artificial neural hierarchies. But it does capture a lot of data. When you manipulate variables and you compare it to the human data in tons of psychophysics experiments, pick up any Josh McDermott paper to see this stuff. For example, sound location, texture recognition, and speaker recognition. It does capture stuff, despite the differences that they all recognize. However, all of these models are adevelopmental. While the internal structure of the network develops, the input is fixed. And we're trying to model this developmental process, the membrane developing. So what we did is we took our cochleograms and we had them develop. So we have a control network in which is optimal all the way through training. These are training epochs, so cycles of training. We have a second condition with a series of networks which mature quite rapidly, eventually reaching the optimal condition. And we have a third series of networks which never reach full basilar membrane maturation. Okay, so we're manipulating this part of the network and we're tracking it in this part. Okay, we're seeing how does this system optimize. In the regular condition, we've got this model which coarsely represents the auditory linguistic pathway, and we're optimizing it to a rapidly maturing basilar membrane supporting high resolution processing. And in our delay condition, we're optimizing it to a slow maturing basilar membrane not supporting high resolution processing. So some results. Spoken word recognition accuracy by training epoch. I'm going to go very light on the results. Please see the paper link at the end if you want all the data and the stats and the p-values and Bayesian and stuff. We see a clear difference in speech recognition accuracy across training, and that holds up a test with about 5% to 6% discrepancy across networks. These are means of a large number of networks in each condition. So spoken word recognition accuracy does tail off. In the regular network, across a series of tasks developed to capture the behavioral data from children with DLD, what we essentially see is high classification accuracy and high probability. So when it's right, it knows it's right. It's saying, I'm 95% sure it's this word. I'm 95% sure I should complete the task like this. Low entropy distributions output over that lexicon. Well, in the maturational delay condition, we see something very different. We see that the network is sort of in a constant state of uncertainty. Okay. So again, we don't have time to have a look at all the item-specific effects we pulled up. If you ask questions about it, I have slides about that hidden away at the end. But in short, we see a developmental delay in this, which maps nicely to the behavioral data from children with DLD. We don't see the network suddenly do something very different, which is possible on the basis of manipulation of the input. And this aligns very well with the data. We do note important differences, and we write about that a ton in the discussion. Okay, so what's the representational basis of these deficits? To answer this question, we turned to statistical physics and borrowed this sort of new framework called mean field theory-based manifold analysis. So in this method, what we're doing here is we're recording from a single, we're recording from a single pyramidal neuron. And we can record spikes in that neuron. And then we can plot these spikes, so we can plot them in spikes per second, we can pool, or we can take them as a trajectory over time. But we can say things to it. We can say, for example, cat, and we can record spikes per second, and we can then say catch, and we can record spikes per second, for example. And we can scale this up to 2 neurons, so neuron 1, neuron 2, and again, we can say cat, catch, cat, 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 catch, catch, catch. So here, the idea just is to illustrate the point is that neuron 1 is responding more to the green stimulus than the blue. And this could be a phoneme, it could be a word, it could be a structure. Again, this is a real spike train from 9 neurons, and you could scale it up indefinitely. So here's what we've got. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 neurons, and we've got 2 stimuli, and you can keep adding to these. And the point is that the more exemplars you perceive in these 2 categories, the more these clusters start to approximate a continuous manifold. We go from these clusters to a continuous manifold. And this is seen as the basis of categorization in some sense in this neural state space, in the sense that if you have a pattern of neural response that is over here, it seems similar implicitly, you're not conscious of this, right? But it seems similar to neural responses you've encountered previously on exposure to cat in that context with those speakers. And it's a whole environment of stuff, not just language, it's the whole world of it's your state space in that whole context. Something down here will be, oh, that's likely to be the blue thing, and this is likely to be a speech error or something perhaps worth acquiring. Now, the statistical physics stuff lets us measure these manifolds, and what it points to is in both biological and artificial pathways, not a layer-to-layer correspondence between the brain and artificial neural networks. Very few people talk like that, but it's a gradual change in manifold structure. We go from low-level patterns of response in the auditory nerve, which overlap massively. So for example, cat and catch, the same neurons are involved in representing both those things at a low level. But as you travel up the auditory linguistic pathway, these become increasingly dissociated. And what we have here is a simulated working memory system, this is going to become important later, which dips inside its long-term memories and differentiates here the word cat from all competitors. It retrieves that. So you go from a representational basis, which is really difficult to actually retrieve from because the same neurons are firing, but then it becomes through technical things like the hierarchical structure of both biological and artificial systems, they become increasingly low dimensional. So again, we are looking now here and looking at the shape, and we're considering the dimensionality of the activated long-term speech representations and the network's classification capacity, which is the statistical physics term for how easily these representations can be differentiated from competitor representations. Okay, so you can see they're sort of 2 sides of the same coin. So here we're plotting representational changes. This is using the statistical physics approach to measure the manifolds, these patterns of activation in these neural state spaces, as they change through training. And what you see is that the delay network really struggles to reduce the dimensionality of its long-term representations. What that means is that literally more neurons are involved in the representation of that category. It hasn't been able to reduce that to form an efficient representation of the form that the control and regular networks do. This, of course, links, on the other hand, to the classification capacity deficit. Because you have patterns of activation which are highly overlapping, they're high dimensional, it's very difficult to retrieve any given neuron, any given representation. Cats like that, catches like that, the attentional system comes in and doesn't know where, because the same populations of neurons are implicated in the representation of both. And you can see this similar thing across layers. And in trained networks, these are low-level layers in the neural network. These are high-level. And what you can see, okay, I'm going to try the laser. Up here is that the regular and control sort of approach similar dimensionality. The delay is quite higher. This is statistically significant. And up here too, you see the same sort of pattern. So graphically, that gets a bit abstract, but graphically what we're seeing, when we have a typically maturing basilar membrane in these artificial systems, we go from these overlapping auditory nerve representations, which are exploiting the same pattern, the same populations of neurons, to something that looks a bit more like that. When we have low-dimensional neural speech encodings that form an efficient basis for working memory. And you can see the working memory system is easily able to dip in and separate cat from its competitors. When we have a basilar membrane deficit, we see something a lot more like this, what we've called residual manifold entangling. So the high-end neural representations of these words overlap, they exploit the same patterns of neural activation, and that means the working memory system can't actually dip in and take anyone out of it. So these are long-term speech representations with high-dimensional structure that do not form an efficient basis for working memory. So why is this finding in particular important? Well, the reason is in the field of developmental language disorder, perhaps the dominant causal account implicates a working memory capacity deficit as a causal feature. So we go from the idea under this account that you have a spoken word representation. This, at some point, it's all very abstract and it's sort of a box and arrows model. This, at some point, hits a working memory capacity bottleneck, which results in the formation of fuzzy long-term speech representations, thank you, which then compromises the whole system. And this influences our interpretation of clinical practice. So when you speak to SLTs, for example, who are doing familiar sequences, number repetition, span task type stuff, they might use this interpretation based on the sort of Baddeley and Hitch 1974 model, that what we see in the performance deficit is a capacity limitation in the phonological loop of these children, okay? It also influences how we teach our children because we use CogMed, for example, in schools, and Jungle Memory and similar programs. Schools pay these huge fees to have these licenses to do working memory training and attentional capacity training in schools. And unfortunately, we know that the working memory literature is not only somehow in some ways quite poorly defined in terms of the constructs it posits, but we don't see any evidence really of working memory training. We don't see long-lasting effects, we don't see transfer effects. And there's a ton of problems, not only listed in the paper linked to the study I'm presenting today, that put a question mark over this bottleneck view of DLD, that we're seeing a working memory bottleneck which is functionally discrete from long-term speech representations and which plays a causal role in DLD. Indeed, these simulations that we presented today suggest that if you have this low-level spectral processing deficit, and we do see that commonly in DLD, this comes for free. You go from the idea that a working memory capacity bottleneck causes long-term speech representations, deficits, to the idea that long-term speech representation deficits themselves attributable to a deficit perhaps in basilar membrane maturation and auditory brainstem optimization, cause long-term speech representation deficits, which then give rise to apparent working memory capacity bottlenecks. Okay, so in summary, high-resolution frequency sensitivity is essential to the effective processing of natural speech. Frequency sensitivity results from the auditory brainstem and cortex attuning to structural properties of the basilar membrane, that mechanical gradient. The structure of the basilar membrane matures during the prenatal period, with the auditory brainstem and cortex then optimizing through childhood. And this maturational trajectory can be derailed, for instance, by modifying MLN2. A computational model, this is the first step. We intend to test this stuff in human participants. A computational model of atypical basilar membrane maturation shows a delayed language acquisition profile, poor speech classification accuracy, and uncertainty resembling word-finding problems even when performing accurately. And we have a ton of stuff replicating item-specific effects to go along with that, despite important differences. And we also see artificial neural activation patterns which are poorly optimized. We go from those low-level noisy representations, those noise-sensitive representations in the auditory nerve, and through a processing of pooling functions and hierarchical structure, we never really resolve that entangling problem. We have overlapping speech representations. And this, of course, means that working memory capacity limitations are emergent in this system rather than causal. Classification capacity is overwhelmed by activated, low-precision speech representations. Thank you very much.
Sam. We started a little bit late, so there's plenty of time for questions. Usual rules apply, so the student microphone's over there and the staff microphone on this side. And we'll monitor for the online attendance as well.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Josh Hartshorn from Boston College,
Hi.
and that was a super cool talk, and I really enjoyed the exploration of downstream effects of upstream issues,
Thank you.
and sort of work that I think we should see a lot more of. So I want to push you on seeing a lot more of it, and see if you thought about pushing this further downstream to grammar induction, right? Because you might expect that certainly uncertainty about what the words are is going to make it harder to induce grammar, but you might also, I actually have absolutely no idea, but you might anticipate that certain kinds of grammatical patterns would be easier or harder to learn,
Yes.
given uncertainty about what exactly the words are.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you have pushed it further.
So I think we use spoken words in this case because we had the auditory waveform data. We had enough of it that we could take random samples and train these neural networks. I don't think there's anything unique within this framework about the word as a unit of representation. As I mentioned, in this case, we took the idea of pooling the number of spikes per second. So you pool it and you say, well, this is more active over 1 second than this. You can do exactly the same thing, and it is being done by a team in NYU, who do sentences like this and see it as a trajectory over time. So where you have your axis, for example, of your neural state space, rather than a simple dot vector, what you see is a trajectory over time. And then when you have a sentence, for example, I'm going to play football tomorrow, you have a trajectory like this through that neural state space. And then you have, she's going to play rugby tomorrow, and it cuts through similar, in some ways, state space, depending on the context and all that kind of stuff. But then the overlap comes over time through that. So I think the same principles totally apply. And that if you have this auditory perceptual deficit, it's going to have the same sort of impact, that you're not capturing in each element of whatever scale you're working on, you're going to have this noise in the system, and a system which optimizes to noise. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I think much of it applies in exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Love the talk. I'm Nick Richards from Newcastle University. I completely agree about the working memory literature, how it seems to be going down a dead end. But the research made me think of Paula Talal's research on temporal processing, which it has a pitch element, but it also has a temporal element. And I think it's quite similar to your paradigm. And she devised a program called Fast Forward, which I don't know it very well, but I think the aim was to accentuate a lot of the high frequency sounds. That, I think, also found there wasn't much evidence for the program, but according to your research, maybe there is something in that kind of program after all.
I'm so glad you asked this question. I was desperate to say
wasn't
something about this. So we talked the other day about manipulating variables, right, in this stuff, okay? Here, you can see an illustration of a spoken word representation on the left panel, okay? We have something like form and structure, okay? The work that Bishop and MacArthur have done says that the deficit in DLD is likely to be spectral in nature, not temporal. The reason being that you can change, do you remember those dots I showed? If you reduce the different dot in terms of the frequency window, you get a big effect in DLD, and that's totally independent of the temporal difference. If you decrease or increase interstimulus interval, you don't really see a big drop. It's all about spectral processing. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, in this neural network, we did want to do a variant. We did start with this approach. There's these two visions in DLD. One is temporal in nature, one is spectral in nature. So we started by wiping out spectral information. So we added spectral, we reduced spectral resolution across the y-axis. You see this huge drop-off. You do the same across the temporal axis, you don't see any difference. In this specific case of spoken word classification, you do with respect to sound localization, and there's good reasons from psychophysics why that would be the case. But for spoken word classification, you don't see it. That's really interesting because there is, Paula Talal's work was 1970s work, which says DLD is all about the temporal structure of this stuff. It's too quick and the brains don't work quick enough to be able to decompose this. That doesn't seem to be right. And this suggests, well, this is probably why it's not right, because if you degrade across that axis, you still have the information you need to do spoken word recognition. And you're right, that work doesn't replicate well, and it's fallen out of favor because the fast forward program of intervention doesn't really work. And this provides, again, this backs that up.
But I can see lots of potential implications of this research for intervention, I think, so that makes it quite exciting.
It is essentially just a computational model of the Bishop and MacArthur 2004 work with on spectral processing and ruling out the possibility that it's temporal. This provides a good reason why, because if you degrade across the x-axis, you don't see a difference. If you degrade across the y-axis, you see a huge difference. Okay. That's the information you need. That's the critical feature you need to solve spoken word encoding recognition for you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, man. Cheers.
Thank you.
Hi, Wojciech Paczynski, University of Oregon. This is extremely interesting and I think super plausible. I'm kind of wondering though if there's, I mean, I can imagine a lot of other ways of injecting noise into the system, right? That might also have some biological correlates like delay of myelinization in the auditory cortex and so on. So I'm wondering if there's sort of specific errors that are predicted from an impairment at the cochlear level that wouldn't be predicted by impairments sort of further downstream?
So in some ways, so firstly, if you look at the behavioral literature and the neurophysiological literature, and it suggests strongly that it's not temporal in nature, as those early verbal accounts suggested, which were pretty not particularly rigorous. If you look at that literature and you say, okay, well, it seems to be spectral in nature, not frequency, not temporal in nature, then at that point, that points to certain parts of the auditory pathway, because certain things like chopper neurons work with solving the temporal noise problem, and there's certain other parts of the architecture that solve the spectral problem. And so it points to certain parts of the system, and I totally agree that it could be any part of that. And I sort of cheekily said, and MLIN too is also implicated in the elasticity of the basilar membrane. That's true, but in the paper, there are tons of ways that you could knock out the gradient, the mechanical gradient of the basilar membrane. It might not be basilar membrane, it might be after that, it might be to do with the basilar membrane is fine at full-term birth, but then after that, the optimization of this whole system, there might be something to do with that. You know, they talked about cortical dysplasias, which are sort of tangles of neurons and things like to do with neuronal migration. It could be to do with that, nothing to do with the basilar membrane. But my view is, and I say all this in this paper, the point is, if you're looking at spectral processing deficits, the basilar membrane is the place to start. We can test this. We can test for MLN2, we can test for using like functional like light microscopy methods, we can check this stuff. Let's start there, because that's the most conservative point to start at. And then we can work down the system. And that seems to be the way to do it. But I totally agree, it could be any number of things. This is just the most conservative, simple starting point, I think.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. I think we should leave it there, but thanks for a great talk.
Thank you very much.